16th of November 2010. Ubisoft Montreal releases Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, and with it came the shiny new multiplayer mode, where players have to hunt down an assigned target whilst evading players that are hunting them at the same time. A tense cat and mouse game that combines the traditionally stealthy assassin experience with the unpredictability of a multiplayer social deduction game. But here's the thing, right? You might be a bit confused as to why I'm showing footage of a completely different game in the background. This is Bloody Good Time, made by indie developer Adelaide Studios. Now for starters, this game was also published by Ubisoft and released less than a month before Brotherhood. And just like in Brotherhood's multiplayer, the objective is for players to hunt down an assigned target whilst evading players that are hunting them. Okay, pretty similar game modes published by the same developer less than a month apart on two wildly different projects in terms of style and scale. Something doesn't seem to add up. So naturally, I got curious and started going deeper into this rabbit hole. And in my digging, I actually managed to find and interview the co-founder of Adelaide Studios. And he revealed an untold story. A story about broken promises, a story about exploitation,
Ubisoft just destroyed us bit by f***ing bloody bit.
And a story about a third game. A game that blended together many different genres to create a stealth multiplayer experience that really was ahead of its time. A game whose developer Ubisoft took advantage of, and a game that today has been forgotten and abandoned. This is the story of It all starts with Chris Peck, a game designer living in Scotland who, in the late 90s and early 2000s, was working for VIS Entertainment, a British video game developer who is mainly known for cartoon tie-in games, but also the commercially successful State of Emergency published by Rockstar, and of course, a release that changed the gaming landscape forever, Earthworm Jim. Now, Chris, for years, had been passionate about blending together ideas from board games and live-action games he was familiar with. But it was during a conversation at a bar with friends one day that he came across an idea that stuck in his head. A Hitman-style stealth game, except it would be multiplayer. Over the next few weeks and months, what started as a casual conversation grew into mechanics, systems, and eventually a potential game. And so, wanting to take the next step in his career, on the 10th of March 2003, he and a handful of friends decided to start a game development company, Adelaide Studios. But as you can probably imagine, being a small team of designers and coders who together hadn't made a game before, the biggest hurdle they had was getting funding. No publisher was going to fund their ideas, especially when those ideas weren't guaranteed moneymakers in the past.
But really, also what they want is that game to have sold and know how many copies it sold, and then they'll talk to you, right? Up until that point, it's just a nightmare dealing with publishers.
And so eventually, they sort of realized that they need to make a playable version of their game to better demonstrate their vision. And so in 2004, they made a Half-Life 1 mod called The Ship, and released it to the public for free. The game was simple. Kill your designated target with weapons you find around the map. You also have needs that you need to tend to. And whilst balancing all of this, another player is trying to hunt you down. It was basic in terms of graphics, polish, and function, but people really liked how the mod blended together existing mechanics from varying different games, and soon enough it garnered thousands of downloads, and it was even a finalist for being Mod of the Year in 2004.
We made that, and then we took it to publishers and went, look, you can play it, and they went, is it going to look like that? And we're like, no, it's not going to look like that. That's a mod using Half-Life 1. Of course it's not going to look like that. And they were like, no, can't imagine it. And you're just like, for fuck's sake.
But one company did take notice. You see, it was around this time that Valve were gearing up to release the highly anticipated sequel to Half-Life 1, Half-Life 2, and alongside it, they would unveil that brand new Source engine, the successor to Gold Source. And so Adelaide used this opportunity to prototype and further expand on their mod. Now, Valve were already pretty impressed with the small mod Adelaide had made. Valve asked if the studio would like to make and sell a standalone version of the ship on a new digital distribution platform they were creating called Steam. This solved two problems for Adelaide. One, this big company was offering a platform to sell their game on, and two, Adelaide had this brand new engine to make a bigger, better version of their mod that the community loved. The team wasn't big, and so development was very difficult, but the announcement that they were making an official game finally helped secure funding from friends and family. With all this positive community support, distribution access, and funding, the team was finally able to start working on the game they wanted to make. Multiple maps inspired by real-life luxury ocean liners filled with detailed bars, dining areas, pools, and shops, multiple new weapons, improved UI, as well as new game modes. And on the 11th of July 2006, a standalone version of the game, now titled The Ship Murder Party, was released on Steam. Now, they also added this short single-player mode, and the premise is that this Squid Game type tournament had been set up by a person called Mr. X, but there's not really much lore beyond that. The actual missions boil down to a series of fetch quests where you're collecting things for people on the ship in exchange for either money or freedom.
Now leave me. I want to buff my helmet.
I think it does a decent job at tutorializing the mechanics of the game, but the main focus of the ship was still its multiplayer mode. The wide range of weapons, from automatic rifles to everyday items, gave players several different options to take out their target, and to prevent players from only using the best weapons, ammo was often limited, bombs were single use, and the money for kills chart dictated which weapons would give you the most money. Meaning it was often a good idea to find better graded weapons if you actually wanted to win the game. And just like in the mod, being caught meant you pay fines and lose your weapons. The surveillance elements were now more well defined, and this gave players yet another thing they had to juggle. And adding to this juggling was, again, the needs system. As mentioned previously, players have needs that need to be tended to avoid debuffs. To do this, players often need to go to hotspots or put themselves in vulnerable positions. Now, this did a great job of adding a sense of paranoia, as players had to weigh up the risks and rewards of their actions. Do you go find a drink before you die of thirst, or risk your target slipping away? Do you sleep right now, or wait to confirm that the guy in the corridor isn't going to barge in and kill you? And when all of the different systems in the ship clicked together, the resulting gameplay was dynamic, and quite often it was funny. I'm sure many of these clips give off the sense that the ship is this goofy little game with a bunch of wacky ideas mushed into one. And well, on the surface it is, but I think it's important to point out what Adelaide was trying to do here. The whole design philosophy behind this game was to reverse engineer mechanics from very different genres into one singular cohesive experience. And by doing so, they were actually predating much of the more tactical games that you see that are popular today. I mean, think about how many different games share this core gameplay loop. Rounds starting with little to no tension as you gather food, weapons, resources, and set up.
I'd like a hot number 2 to go.
Then follows a gradual rise in tension as you recon for your target whilst remaining discreet and balancing other variables. And all of it leads to a spontaneous crescendo where absolutely anything can happen.
When they're signing a man in the chair, oh well, I'm sure nothing can go wrong.
Now, this isn't to say the game didn't have any issues. The map layouts can sometimes feel confusing, and this was made worse by poor UI decisions and the control scheme. The AI was absolutely awful, spending most of their time running into walls. They're also barely able to defend themselves and have no understanding of the surveillance system. Now, even though the game does a good job at preventing players from randomly killing people that aren't their targets, there still remained issues with balancing and exploits. Intentionally getting caught to avoid your hunter was one of the main ones. Another one, for example, was that amenities cost essentially nothing compared to how much you earned per kill, meaning you never had to worry about money to tend to any of your needs. And I could go on about the various other smaller issues with the game, but the single biggest problem with the ship was that it sort of failed commercially. Now, looking from the outside, they sold an impressive number of copies considering they were a small, self-funded team with minimal marketing. But the reality was that the game didn't make a big enough splash to keep the company in the green. Now, we can point to a few different factors that might have caused this, but it was likely a combination of all of them that led to what happened soon after.
It gets down to the point that it's basically me and the operations director are the only two left. We've still got the building that we're working in, but all the team is gone.
The literal and metaphorical ship wasn't going to stay afloat for long. So with little options left, as a last Hail Mary, they decided to fly to Gamescom in San Francisco to once again, like a couple of years ago, propose new ideas to publishers and investors. And even though they had a well-reviewed game under their belt now, things seemed to be panning out exactly the same as before the ship. Each pitch was met with rejection after rejection after rejection. All hope was lost, knowing full well that the company's fate was sealed when they got back home. They had one final meeting, with none other than Ubisoft. Now, unexpectedly, they were actually interested in the ship and were very motivated to fund a sequel.
And I'm sitting there thinking, is this a wind-up? Like, are you taking the piss, or like, you know? And obviously it's Ubisoft. Don't think they're famous for taking the piss.
But of course, he knew that they had no other options. They had come so far, and this was their golden ticket.
Which I think when we left the building, we gave each other a hug and just about wept. You know, I mean, like it was like we were so fucked that to have someone just sort of basically miraculously save you at that point.
In fact, Adelaide had to essentially pretend to be a company that was still functioning so that Ubisoft would confirm that this project was going to go ahead.
Good thing was it was the timing, I can't remember, you know, but it was like a month after we'd let them all go, you know. I mean, it was, people hadn't got new jobs yet. I mean, everyone's a bit burnt out at the end of a game project and it takes time and stuff. So Ubisoft, bless them, if they'd have just known, if they were worried about intellectual property, all they needed to do was wait a week and we'd have been dead, you know. There was nothing left.
But the irony in all of this was that Adelaide had no idea that this deal that they thought was going to save the company would actually end up being the worst thing that happened to them. So what was the deal? Ubisoft initially offered around $4.5 million, and alongside it, they also promised marketing for the game and conceded that Adelaide would be able to retain the rights to the IP. Now, this money was an advance on royalties, which meant that Ubisoft was lending this money to Adelaide. Adelaide's royalty share was around 20% for every copy of the game sold. So after all other parties got their cut, Adelaide had to use this remaining money to pay back Ubisoft, and only after their debt was fully paid would Adelaide make a single dime. Now, like me, you're probably asking several questions at this point, like why did they take this shitty deal? Why didn't they go to Valve instead, like they did with the ship? Well, as outlined, Chris already had a history of pitching to many other publishers, and he claims that they just didn't want to take risks on experimental games. As for Valve, they've historically not really funded other developers and prefer to make their games in-house. But if you remember back, the most curious aspect of this was that Ubisoft were the ones who were forthcoming and impressed with the ship. They wanted a sequel to be made. So considering all of this, Adelaide just thought, Ubisoft, big name, they're interested in us. Sure, the deal isn't the best, but we just have to make a great product and we'll be rewarded, right? Well, during pre-production, Adelaide began making prototypes of the game and delivering on what Ubisoft asked for, in the process hiring a larger team. Keep in mind, they now were also having to make a game for both PC and Xbox. And it was during this time that Ubisoft decided to show their true colors. They said, you know what, we're no longer going to sell retailed box copies of the game, because we don't think anyone's going to buy or play the game. So in addition to that, we're also going to cut the budget to $2 million. Now, Chris states in forum posts and in the interview that they would have still been able to deliver the promised content of the game with the $2 million budget if that's what they were given from the get-go. But now the demands remained the same, and they still had this larger team, but with less money. And this is when reality really started settling in for Adelaide. Ubisoft spent the rest of production constantly wanting rework after rework, ripping away much of Adelaide's creative freedom.
We went to France and they went, we hate it. You know, it's France. We had this game, you know, I'm sorry to French people.
So the culmination of this hellhole development timeline was that by the time BGT came out, it was a very different game to what Adelaide had envisioned. In fact, the studio wasn't even there to witness it. Staff were gone, offices were closed. It was literally just Chris, hoping the game would somehow sell enough so he could call everyone back. And of course, that didn't happen. Now, it's important to start by saying that many of the negative reviews of BGT point to its gameplay loop being tedious and repetitive, as well as many optimization issues. It's impossible to blame Ubisoft entirely for these downsides, as Adelaide's lack of experience and previous issues with balancing in their games could have also contributed to how this game turned out. But I don't think Ubisoft pulling the rug from underneath them made things any easier.
The best thing we did was create a wonderful team of wonderful people. I loved those people. And Ubisoft just destroyed us bit by fucking bloody bits. Till in the end, the team was almost killing each other because it was awful. It's what people do in shit circumstances.
Many of the good reviews were either fans of the ship or newer players who praised the fresh concept of the game and how under the radar it fell. And remember when I said Ubisoft promised marketing for the game? Well, BGT was marketed as yet another generic deathmatch shooter with no emphasis on what made the game unique. In hindsight, Chris suggests that Ubisoft didn't actually care all that much about the game's success. Instead, they just wanted to absorb the premise of the ship from Outer Light and repurpose it into their own game.
I think the reason they did it, I've always felt, was intellectual property right, was I think they were worried we were going to sue them for Assassin's Creed multiplayer, which I could understand why, but we had no money, which they didn't know.
And this is a pretty plausible explanation. I mean, how else could they unveil Brotherhood's multiplayer as a groundbreaking, innovative experience if an indie team were doing the same exact thing several years prior? By approaching Outer Light with an exploitative deal, blunting their creative freedom and draining their financial resources, Ubisoft got exactly what they wanted. Bloody Good Time was a Ubisoft IP, which meant the premise of the ship was also now accessible. And so, as Outer Light sunk in the distance, Ubisoft sailed on with its treasures to present to the world what they claimed they had made for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood.
The core gameplay mechanics of the single player into the multiplayer environments. And that was kind of a challenge because there were high expectations for that, and we had to come up with something quite innovative.
With the company dissolved and BGT with Ubisoft, the ship IP was sold to another indie studio called Blazing Griffin. Now, they used the ship IP as leverage to essentially build their company from scratch. They launched a Kickstarter for a steampunk-themed sequel for the ship, which, perhaps due to a confusing announcement video and a lack of clear footage of this planned game, it failed to meet the funding goal. Blazing Griffin have always maintained that they can't make large-scale changes to the game as they didn't have the license to the source engine. So this, combined with the failure of the Kickstarter, meant that they pivoted to making a HD remaster of the ship Murder Party from the ground up with the Unity engine. Now this released into early access in 2016, and despite being released a full decade after the ship, it seemed to be missing basic functions the source version of the game had, and it also had several optimization issues. Blazing Griffin then continued to put band-aids on most of these problems and seemingly just abandoned it. In 2018, they yet again rehashed the ship into a different game, which also died after release, and soon after they again abandoned it. By this point, Blazing Griffin had morphed into a digital entertainment company, working on projects across many different mediums, not just in video games. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about Blazing Griffin in this story. On one hand, they're just another indie startup like Outer Light, with, I assume, talented and passionate developers who'd worked hard to get to where they are today. But on the other hand, the company heavily relied on the IP to expand their business, which to this day they're still best known for. And what's especially tragic was that the original ship kind of had a resurgence in popularity on YouTube in and around this time, with many big creators making let's plays and funny moment compilations around it. But of course, by that point, it was too late. Outer Light were gone, Chris Peck was out of the gaming industry entirely, and the ship concept slowly began fading into irrelevance. At the end of the day, the story of the ship was that it was a bit of a jack of all trades. Not quite an out-and-out shooter, not quite a complete stealth game, and you couldn't even call it a social deduction game or a simulator. But what it did do, in a small, neat little way, was blend together what was familiar, and in the process create something new. But perhaps its greatest achievement was that it left many great memories for a lot of people. And if you ask me, I'd say that's a pretty good legacy to have left behind.
That's what you get.
Are you my quarry?
Is that a bomb?